after that, after we had a nice break, now we're going to talk about moving beyond simple experiments. So in fact, I think we've already had a lot of these conversations, which is great, of thinking about, again, how we can do more than A/B tests, or how we can do more than, in the social science sense, I think a lot of people say, oh, I've done this, the effect of this is X. They just say, like, does this thing work? And they don't often think about why it works or how it works or where it could work differently and so on. So we want to move beyond just doing an experiment to measure an effect to doing an experiment to measure an effect and do more. So I think this is sort of the two cultures of experimentation. So I think the computer science, data science culture, especially from industry, are these kinds of optimization experiments. So the most famous example of one of these is the 41 shades of blue that they did at Google. So in this experiment, they wanted to figure out what is the optimal link color. And so they just say, we're going to try 41 different shades of blue and see which one leads to the most click-throughs. And this style is, to many social scientists, seems very foreign. Because they're not actually really learning, and they're not understanding anything about how people respond to color or who's doing something. It's just like pure optimization. So it seems like sort of the social science style, we want to figure things out, but that then often doesn't seem to be very much related to optimization. So there are papers about like how people respond to colors where they bring them into a lab and like show them a shape and a color and measure their response time. There's all this very abstract stuff about understanding cognitive processing of colors. So it sort of seems like there's this two cultures of experimentation, but what I want to argue is that really both of these cultures kind of need each other. So for people who are doing these optimization experiments, like it makes sense to think a little bit about what you're doing, because there may be a lot of ideas, ways you could design your experiments differently, theories you could draw on to help you optimize more efficiently. And likewise, for social scientists who are not used to this kind of optimizing approach, I think a lot of our questions could be expressed as optimization experiments in a way that would be interesting. So rather than like, does this treatment lead to a change in public opinion? It would be, let's find the treatment that leads to the biggest change in public opinion. Right, so it's not necessarily clear that that would lead to something interesting, but it's not clear that it wouldn't, I would say. So what we're going to do now is try to create a hybrid of these two styles. This is the paper that you read about in the book about the social norms and electric use. So roughly what they did is they showed people, their idea was if you show people the amount of energy that their neighbors are using, this will cause people to use less electricity because of social norms. So they did the experiment and they got basically no effect after 1 week and 3 weeks. So this is the change in energy consumption from showing people how they're doing relative to their neighbors. So it seems like this experiment has no effect. And if we were doing a simple A/B test kind of thing, that might be what we concluded from this. But they were more in the understanding frame, and they had some actual ideas about what might be happening. And so they said, you know what, we think that these effects are going to be different for people who are heavy users of electricity and light users of electricity. And so if you split out the results, you see that this is in fact what happened. So this treatment caused the people who were above average to use less, and it caused the people who were below average to actually use more. So it had the opposite effect that they were intending on some users. So basically people got this thing, they're like, oh, I'm not using enough electricity, I should start using more. So they thought, and according to the way the paper is written, they anticipated this happening, and they had a second treatment which they had designed specifically because they thought this particular psychological process might happen. And that is adding in this emoticon to show people that not only are they using less, but this is a good thing. It doesn't mean you should start using more. So this one very simple change almost entirely eliminates this boomerang effect. So the people who are using more, they still use slightly more, but much less than before. So you have an original treatment that has basically no effect on average. It turns out that is an illusion that's created by some aggregation of two disparate groups. You make a slight modification to the treatment, and then it eliminates one of the negative effects, and you get then the effect that you want overall. So here's a case where, let's say you're in pure optimization mode. All you care about is lowering the amount of energy people use. Thinking carefully about what might be happening, thinking about heterogeneity, thinking about the mechanisms at work, is going to help you optimize better. Also, we see here, we've actually learned something interesting about the way people respond to information about their peers. So this, I think, is an example of how thinking can help you more. Now, if, for example, you're one of these optimization people, like, let's say if you were gonna do 1 million A/B tests on this, you might change the color, you might do all kinds of things, but it's very unlikely that in your A/B testing, you would think, oh, there's this other social norm that we should be trying to trigger, right? So it's hard for me to imagine someone hill climbing their way to this, right? It seems like the best way to get to that is to have an idea and a theory and think carefully about what you're doing. And the great thing is that we don't have to be, I find this experiment to be incredibly creative, but we don't really have to be like geniuses to create experiments like this, because there's certain ideas that, if we keep them in mind, can help us make experiments like this even if we're not creative geniuses. And so I think there are these 3 ideas. If we keep these 3 ideas in mind, it will help us make more interesting experiments than just saying this works or it doesn't work. And so they're validity, heterogeneity of treatment effects, and mechanisms. Question?
No, a comment.
Comment, yeah.
So this is all really helpful, I think, for me, and it also leads me to think about a kind of slightly geekier takeaway, which is also, it's not that it had no effect on average, but it had no effect on the average, which is that if they had looked at, say, the variance or something and done just an F test, they would have seen that collapsing. So for me, it's a kind of reminder to look at the data in more ways, I guess.
Yeah, look carefully at the data. Don't just run a t-test. It's a great idea. But then you have to be worried about fooling yourself. So when we talk more about heterogeneity of treatment effects, you notice I said I think they anticipated this ahead of time, because there are ways that you could go wrong looking at the data and finding patterns in the data. And so but that is not an unsolvable problem. If you're aware of it, there are things you can do to work against it. Other questions? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about each of these 3 things now. Validity. So validity, in the same way that the total survey error framework kind of gave you a checklist of things to think about when you're evaluating someone else's experiment, and it gave you kind of a language to talk about what these problems are. I think validity is similarly like a framework for thinking about all the kinds of problems that can happen when you do an experiment. And this is, again, really important to know what your problem is, because you have to know that before you can fix that problem. Right? If you have general concern about an experiment and you can't be specific, this is sort of a way to help you be more specific. So statistical conclusion validity, this is basically like, were the statistics done appropriately? So you could obviously screw up your conclusion if you don't do the statistics properly. That is the subject of there's a lot of books about that. I'm not going to talk much about that. Internal validity, this is sort of captures some of the concerns we've heard here about, does the treatment spill over into the control group? Does everyone in the treatment group actually receive the treatment? There's this idea, if you're a computer scientist, you might never have heard this, but like lab experiments are good for internal validity. Like everything is kind of done according to plan in lab experiments much more than field experiments. That's kind of a crude heuristic that people have. I think it's reasonably true. I think with a lot of online experiments, offer the possibility of doing field experiments with higher internal validity, in the sense that if you have a well-designed experimental infrastructure in an online system, you should be able to deliver the treatment to the people that you want to, and not deliver the treatment to the other people, and measure the outcomes on all of the people. So I think in general, online experiments should have relatively high internal validity, but of course, everyone who has actually done one of these knows that they can get screwed up in many possible ways. So you should not automatically assume that everything has worked right. And one, I guess, should we talk about balance checks? So one crude thing you can do is you can check the characteristics of the treatment and control group, and if they are really different on some observable dimension, then that's a sign, for example, that your randomization might not have been done correctly. And that has happened in very famous experiments. It was later discovered the randomization got screwed up, and that was, embarrassing. Another thing, another kind of validity idea is this idea of construct validity. And so this is a little bit more abstract. And so what are constructs? How many social scientists have heard this word construct? How many people want to try to define it? Yeah, it's really hard. I struggled with this a lot. So what I would say is a construct, for the computer scientist, I would say a construct is kind of an abstract idea that social scientists like to think about. So democracy is a construct. And so we have, our theories are often about constructs, like democracy promotes peace or something like that. Sorry to the political scientists, I'm sure that's crude. So then, though, you have to actually measure democracy. How do you actually, so we're going to score the US as a democracy on a scale of 1 to 10. How would we do that? And how would we do that for every single country in the world? That's really hard. And there's enormous amounts of work that have gone into that. But so often when social scientists talk, they talk about these abstract ideas, and then the things that we measure are very different. So thinking about using Twitter as a representation of a social network, right? So for example, a lot of ideas about social networks come from thinking about structures of friendships. And then we have data from Twitter, which is followers. So is that the same thing? Is that a good operationalization of that construct of friendship? Maybe or maybe not. So my favorite example from experiments is there's this book by Jim Manzi, who's a consultant who helps businesses set up experiments. And he tells this story of, he and some colleagues, I think, set up some experiments for the CEO of a retailing company. And in retail, there's this idea that the store window, the front of the store, it's very important for generating traffic. So they invest a lot in putting cool stuff in the window. And so they tried to test this experimentally, and they did different designs and tried to measure their effects. And their conclusion was that it was a waste, and that investing resources in the window was not helping revenue, and they should stop doing it. And the CEO said, "No, I don't believe you." And they're like, "No, but we did all of our t-tests correctly, we randomized appropriately, we did it all, it was totally correct." And he's like, "No, you just have really bad designers. We need to get better designers." Right? And so here, he's not questioning the randomization, he's not questioning the t-test. The CEO was questioning whether they had actually created a treatment that captures the construct of attractive windows. And so whenever you have one of these experiments, I think there's a bias towards giving experiments a free pass, I think. They're like, "Oh, it's an experiment. That must be right." So experiments are really good for one kind of thing, but it doesn't give them a free pass from concerns about these other things. And so it's often helpful when you have an experiment to try to replace the construct that the person is saying. So when people give talks, they often speak about the constructs. Try to just replace that with what they actually did. So think about Michael Macy when he was talking about friendship has, just replace every time he says friendship with Twitter followers, right? And so that is really what's happening. So if that makes you feel different about what's happening, then that's a construct validity kind of issue. Okay? So the last thing is external validity. So this is roughly how would this experimental result be different with different pools of people or a slightly different operationalization of the treatment. This is something that people used to argue about. I don't know if you've seen talks like this where someone presents a result and then someone in the audience is like, I don't think there's a lot of external validity to this claim. And then the speaker says, I think there is. And the audience member says, I don't think there is. And it's just that doesn't lead anywhere. So the good news is that these are actually empirical questions. This is not, we're not arguing about how many angels can fit on the head of a pin or something. Like this is actually, we could just go and do it and figure it out. And as the cost of experiments comes way down, we can potentially actually address this empirically, not based on arguing in a room. And then an example of this comes from the O-power experiments, for example. So there, by mixing the experiment into this already running system, they got to observe the effect not just in one setting, like the first field experiment, but in 111 settings, right? And instead of 300 households in California, 8 million households. So they got to learn two things from doing that. One is that the treatment does seem to work very well even in other places in the US. And the second, though, is that there is a trend towards the treatment working less well as they move into more and more communities. So you get some information about heterogeneity. And I think it's often the case that the very first experiment is usually done in a setting where the person who's doing the experiment thinks it will work. I don't know, this is like, for those of you who have designed experiments and done experiments, you know it's hard and expensive. So if you have to pick one place to do your experiment, you're probably going to pick a place where you think it will work. If you didn't, that would be kind of strange, in fact. So the idea of then doing lots of these replications essentially automatically, because you're into that existing infrastructure, that it adds a lot more confidence in what we can know from the results of any experiment. So that's validity. These are the kind of checklist of ideas that can help you think carefully about concerns that you have about your own study, or that oftentimes people will ask you a question about your experiment, and then you can sort of clump their question into one of these broad categories and then answer not just about their question, but about the concerns as a whole of that kind of category. Okay? Heterogeneous treatment effects. So a lot of experiments in the past have treated people as widgets. They don't know very much about them, and they don't have very many people, so you just do the average effect. This is like a standard lab experiment. Now, in the digital setting, we have different things. First, we have lots of, let's take Facebook, for example. Facebook has tons of information about you. You are not a widget to them. They know, I was going to say everything about you, but not quite everything. They know a lot about you. And they have lots of people in their experiments. So if you have those two things and you're still taking a simple average, you're leaving a lot of information on the table. That's wasteful. So what you can do is you can look and see what is the effect. Let's say, is it different for men and women, or younger people or older people? And this heterogeneity has really important practical value and scientific value. So when we talked about the optimization and the understanding being together, so Facebook really cares about whether their treatments have different effects in different subgroups, even if you're doing pure optimization, right? And in terms of understanding, like a lot of theories come from trying to understand heterogeneity. So if we observe that there is heterogeneity in the response to some treatment, then we have to develop a theory for why that is. So estimating this heterogeneity is often a first step towards building a new theory and or testing an existing theory. So now you have to be careful about how you try to find this heterogeneity. So let me give you an example from clinical trials. Let's imagine we do a study about drug that will lower cholesterol. We get the average treatment effect is 0 if the drug doesn't work. Then we start splitting up the sample into lots of little groups, and then we find it works really well for Hispanic people who are 65 and over who have a college degree. And so then we go to the FDA and we're like, you should just prescribe this drug for these people. And obviously the FDA won't let you do that because they are aware that you are potentially finding this pattern in random data. So the ways to deal with this, so first you have to know this problem exists. That you all know now. This, how do you deal with this problem? So one way is a pre-registration plan. So you sort of say ahead of time which subgroups you're going to look in. And so that avoids the problem of overfishing. And you can actually, now there's a movement in social science to post these things ahead of time so that people can look back at them when you publish your paper to make sure you've done what you said you were going to do. Also now there are a variety of statistical methods that allow you to try to look through the data to find these groups in a way that does not promote overfishing. So there are a number of new papers about this that you all have probably read. I don't have a strong opinion about one or the other, but I know that these all exist. So if you're interested in, if you have a big experiment and you have lots of pretreatment information, you should definitely read these papers about automatic methods to find heterogeneity that don't induce overfishing. I think one strategy a lot of them use is this training test split strategy. So the same idea that Brandon talked about, the same idea we talked about in the Fragile Families Challenge, that idea is a way of also avoiding fishing and overfitting. And yeah, lots of new methods. So any questions about heterogeneity or treatment effects?
I want to make sure I'm understanding this fishing concept right. So that would be, for example, where you've got your giant data set and you've got maybe 100 outcome variables, and you run your regression and you just go through until you find the one that by chance is statistically significant, because 1 out of 20 will be p less than 0.05.
Yeah. So
how does the training testing split help to
Sure.
guard against that?
Sure. So let's say that. So we're going to stick with the case of one outcome and lots of characteristics of people. So let's say we go over here and we just split up the data into lots of groups and find one group where their treatment seems to have an effect. Now, if this is the same idea that if you split it up into 20 groups, there's probably going to be an effect in one of the groups. So, but if we find that effect in this set of data, and then let's say we split our data in half at the beginning, we do this stuff over here, we find a group where there seems to be an effect, and then we go back over here and test it in the data that we didn't use to train up to find that group. It's a little bit like running a second experiment. Very crudely, it's like we've run an experiment and found something, that gives us a theory, then we have this theory and we go over here and use it here. And there's lots, that's the intuition, and then there's lots of papers about this. This is kind of sometimes called the multiple comparisons problem. Yeah?
I was wondering if you could talk about sort of the role of pre-registration of experiments.
Yeah, so I actually have never done pre-registration. I would like to. I think it's interesting. So pre-registration is, has anyone actually done pre-registration? Well, you guys can talk about it then. Let's see. Who has?
Why haven't you?
Why haven't I? Because I haven't done an experiment in a long time. But you can pre-register observational studies too, right? I just haven't. I don't know. I think what I would say, yeah, I'm not. Maybe the stuff I'm doing right now is not amenable to it. Also, that tradition is not very strong in sociology now, so that might be part of it as well. Did you want to talk about your pre-registration experience?
Sure.
Yeah.
To me, I think that what I do is I don't even pre-register an analysis. I just pre-register my holdout plan. And so if you pre-register your experimental design, and then a part of your experimental design, so when you pre-register something, there's this website where if you're running an online experiment, it's really easy because you just submit the HTML code or the Python code or whatever code you're using to run the experiment. You can just submit that as your experimental design, and then your experiment is totally replicable by anyone who downloads your code. If you're not doing that, then you have to describe the experimental procedures and how you're selecting subjects and all that. But they basically have templates for you to fill all these things out. And then you're supposed to also submit an analysis plan. So you submit both the experimental design as well as the, like ideally code that you're going to use to analyze the data, maybe that you've used to analyze pilot data already. And then you submit both the experimental design and the analysis code. What I like to do is just include, like the training and test, I call these confirmatory and exploratory sets. I think that's like a more general word for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'll do is I'll include in my experimental design another condition, like a cross condition with all my other conditions. That's just like randomizing every participant or randomizing every group into either my exploratory subset or my confirmatory subset. And then as that's a part of my experimental design, I no longer have to really pre-register an analysis because I can develop my analysis on the exploratory set and then just run that analysis on the confirmatory set.
But so then this costs you some sample, right? Is another way.
Yeah, but if you want to, I mean, I've never run an experiment where, like, maybe if you run a simple experiment where the analysis is like just a t-test or something,
Yeah.
then you don't need to do this.
Yeah.
All the experiments that I've run have been complex enough that it's, like, there are lots of interesting things that pop up
Yeah.
after I run the experiment. So it's much more beneficial to be able to have flexibility in the analysis than to have to.
Yeah, so that to me is really interesting because I think a lot of the social scientists, they would have this reaction. You've just burned whatever, half your sample. But I think you expressed it differently, which is, no, I've gained a lot. I haven't burned it at all. I've gained a lot from that. So I think that is a tension that I think is really healthy to think about. To what extent you are, because like, you're not burning it. Like, you're using it, right? It's not like you just throw it away. You use it.
It's actually critical, right?
Yeah.
Because, like, we've seen from all these replicability studies that we really need to be using kind of confirmatory sets or not doing all the funky shit we've been doing with statistics. And so it feels like this is pretty much the only way we know right now how to do kind of balanced analysis of experiments.
What's the advantage of that as opposed to just running two separate experiments where you
Oh,
could
because,
pre-register after the first one?
When you randomize within the single experiment, then you're running the same population. And so, like,
So
I've run experiments that like haven't been possible to do again because like the website closed down, or like the target population changes over
So
time.
controls the population.
Yeah. Ideally, I haven't done this yet, but I actually would like to also do this for my pilot experiments because sometimes I've seen minor differences between pilots and like the later experiments I do. So I'm curious if I also randomize between exploratory and confirmatory in my pilots, if I can like detect whether the like decreases in effect size are because of like some kind of overfitting during the pilot, or because the populations were different.
Cool. Any other thoughts about?
Is there a standard place to pre-register?
I think there's. Oh, there is.
OSF is a great place. Anything with a timestamp, really.
Yeah, I think if there's other ones. There's like eGap is one, right?
Yeah.
OSF. It doesn't really matter. Basically, it's a fancy place to just have a website with a timestamp. But OSF is I would just say do OSF. But some people probably, it's like whatever packages in R. Some people have very strong opinions, but like a lot of them are pretty much fine. Yeah.
I think, well, two things. One, the only thing I've ever pre-registered is for a meta-analysis in like the public health realm. And that was really interesting because it was peer-reviewed. So you set your protocol of like what sort of evidence you will qualify within the meta-analysis and which ones you won't. So like you specify, for instance, I will only include randomized control trials that are specific to this population, et cetera, et cetera. And it's peer-reviewed, so you got feedback, like this won't be an appropriate analysis or you're leaving out this important form of subgroup or something like that. And I think in that whole, so you might be able to find pre-registration contexts where you will get feedback on your protocol, which could be neat. Because for me, one of the, in addition to just generally preventing myself from phishing and helping replication in the future, that first step of registration made me think through every step of what I was going to do. And so you're less likely after you run the experiment to be like, damn it, I have no idea what that question response means, because I didn't think about it, or which analysis I was going to, like I can no longer write this analysis or it's not appropriate.
Yeah.
That's what I try to teach my students before you even set up an experiment, to write down the analysis plan in advance. That should be standard for every, whatever we do, observational, experimental, to sit down and clearly think about constructs, hypotheses.
Yeah, I think
that's a good way to formalize all that.
So I think for people who are used to working with digital trace data, this is one of the biggest differences, is that with digital trace data, you usually just go get the data and then you do all the work after the fact. And experiments is kind of exactly the opposite. Like you do all the work before, and then at the end, it's usually really a lot of times it's quite simple. It's not that there's no work in experiments, it's just that the work is usually in a different place. Yeah.
Yeah, following up on that, like I didn't get the utility of pre-reg, especially if I'm running the treatment because I think there's going to be an effect in this direction. It's not that complicated. But like, it saves you so much time on the write-up, right? Like after the experiment is done, you're like, oh, wait a second, I have everything. I can just take that and put it in the paper. Bam. So, just from an efficiency perspective, it's awesome.
So that's a good way to think about it. It's not burning work. It's just moving that work to a different part of the workflow.
Yep.
I don't know if you're going to talk about this, but when I work with computer scientists and programmers in industry, one of the hardest things has been for them to understand experiments with partial or incomplete compliance.
Yes.
They understand that if they control the interface, you can just assign someone to A or B, and they have no choice. They have to deal with the interface that you got. But you can do well-identified, estimates if someone has a choice of whether to take the treatment that you nudged them with.
Yep. I think it's a great. So let me give you a very simple example, and then we'll talk about some of the challenges that actually arise. So there's a concept called intent to treat. So let's imagine you were doing a clinical trial with some new cholesterol drug again. And so someone might get assigned into the treatment condition, and you give them the drug, but then you don't know whether they've actually taken the drug or not. But let's imagine you could somehow track whether they've taken it or not. So then do you want to compare everyone who is assigned in the treatment condition to the people in the control condition, or only the people who take the drug? Because you might say, look, I'm measuring the effect of the drug. I'll just compare the people who've taken the drug. And those are two actually quite different things. So the common approach is to do this intent to treat effect, which is everyone who has received the drug. But if the compliance rate is quite low, then that's going to wash out some of the effect of the drug. And there are lots of things where, more of a social science example, there was this political science paper where they wanted to measure the effect of information on voters, so they gave them a subscription to the newspaper. I think this was also a Gerber and Green thing. So they can give that 100% effectively, but whether people actually read the newspaper they were given, we don't really know. So this is a subtle issue that if you're not used to thinking about can confuse you. So how do you convince people to be careful about that? I don't know. How did you try to do it?
Well, in most cases, I just failed because I couldn't get them to understand instrumental variables.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And I think the key conceptual leap is that there will be some non-random selection into who takes up. If you're offering discounts, then only price-sensitive people will take up the treatment. But having a well-identified causal estimate on a subset of your population, which is just price-sensitive people, that actually I think can be really useful because some policymakers might offer subsidies and they wouldn't affect most of the population at all. It would only affect this little subset of people who are price-sensitive, and that seems to be more successful. But anyway.
So it's interesting though, the heterogeneity is a big part of your explanation. So I think for people who aren't used to thinking about heterogeneity, who are used to thinking of treating people as widgets, that kind of argument is harder. But once you make it clear to people that people are different and only certain groups are picking up the treatment, then I think they might be a little bit more sensitive. Did you have this challenge too?
Yeah, so I actually, I used to work in an education nonprofit where we were trying to study the effect of a particular educational intervention, namely being enrolled in a particular charter school, boarding school. And this was done in conjunction with Roland Fryer, and they tried to describe to us the intent to treat sort of issue where, so say it's a lottery-based admission. So you get chosen as a student to attend the school based on the lottery, but you may not actually choose to go to the school. But but rather than having the treatment effect be based on whether or not you attended the school, it had to be based on whether or not you were chosen in the lottery, because there could have been, like, you sort of have to paint that picture that maybe the school sort of encouraged parents of students with disabilities to not attend the school even if they got chosen, and so then that would bias the treatment effect in a certain way. So it had to be based on intent to treat. And that, like, I think painting that extreme example, like you're saying, is really helpful, even if that's not exactly what the selection story is.
So this is also going to be really valuable for you when we move into the next part about how we actually do these things. A lot of times it will involve working with a partner, and a lot of times that partner won't understand or think about the world in the same way that you do. So the ability to communicate these ideas clearly is really important. Yep.
Another nice thing about the intent to treat is always that we get a fairly conservative estimate of the treatment effect.
Yep.
So that's if you want to err on that side. So that's
So I think the realizing that experiments are more complicated is step one, and then thinking about heterogeneity is usually step two. All right, so mechanisms. So this is the last thing where I think there's great potential synergies between optimization and understanding. So in the book I talk about scurvies and Lyme, and that's great, and like, but really it's not that easy. This is like the hardest thing, I think. So experiments are really good for thinking about, you know, this treatment has this effect. Why does this treatment have this effect? It's actually really, really hard. So I would recommend this paper. So this is Green, who we've talked about several times already. So he and his colleagues have done tons and tons of field experiments. People probably ask him over and over and over, what is going on? All you're doing is showing some black box. Why don't you tell us what's happening? And he wrote this paper. It's like, enough already. Let me explain to you why it's really hard. And they actually have a more technical version of this paper as well, which is good. And so I would really, the scurvy Lyme thing in the book is to get you excited, but then you got to realize it's hard. Yeah?
I was going to say that was like my dissertation defense, where the experimentalists totally got it, but everyone who's not an experimentalist is like, what is going on here? And like the lesson is like, if you're a social scientist and you do mostly experiments, you can say, oh, Green and Gerber say blah, blah, blah. But you do need like some like just here, and then you say like, look, here's my speculation, right, about what's going on, just to sort of satisfy that audience, I think is valuable.
So now there's a new set of experimental designs specifically to test mechanisms. So have you tried any of these?
Yeah.
And?
I don't think there is, I think there's more uncertainty or ambiguity in this discipline about
Yep.
their quality.
So let me just briefly explain what these are. So the idea is, okay, you give people Lymes and you see that they don't get scurvy, and you think the mechanism is vitamin C, so then you should just give them vitamin C. And that's kind of like a test. And in this case, we can do that because it's very easy to separate out the mechanism from everything else, and it's very easy to manipulate that mechanism experimentally. In a lot of social settings, it's much harder. If you want to try to, if you have some proposed mechanism, it's often very hard to change just that mechanism and not a bunch of other things. Also, often there's usually not just one mechanism. So the idea of the scurvy Lyme thing, I think, is a little bit of a potentially misleading example because it's such a simple system. So these three papers, this is by, I guess, a group of economists, this was by some political scientists, and this is by some psychologists. So this is a movement that's happening across fields, and I think this is an interesting thing to think about, but it's challenging in practice, but maybe we'll make some progress on this in the future. So if other experimentalists, how do you deal with this mechanisms problem? This comes up, yeah, does anyone? Yeah, Lisa?
Well, I don't know if this is helpful, but my field experiment instructor in grad school said experiments are really good at testing the effects of causes,
Yeah.
but they're not as good at figuring out the causes of effects. And so you really have to think really carefully about your experimental design and be sure that you have a really strong theory so that you can test a particular mechanism, but kind of working backwards and trying to figure out the cause from the effect is really hard to do.
So another way of thinking about it, Peter?
I guess I'm not sure what sorts of experiments you all are talking about, but in the types of experiments that I've done, complementing them with sort of psychological experiments has helped to identify mechanisms where, like, I'll run one group experiment and then I hypothesize a mechanism, and then I can run a more like psychology-oriented experiment where maybe I simulate the behavior of other actors, and those behaviors I can manipulate. And then I can just test. Once you have all these bots, basically, you have a simulated social system that you can have a lot of control over. And so that's allowed me to basically be able to design experiments that tested every mechanism that I've been interested in.
So I think in field experiments, we're like, let's take the effect of like information on voters. It's hard if you want to do it as a field experiment. It becomes hard to pull apart the different possible mechanisms. It blocks some of them and keeps some of them open. In a lab experiment, it's much easier to do that. And I think this might be, I mean, obviously this is one of the great things about lab experiments is that you can have much more control over what's happening and you can potentially get at some of these mechanisms. And I think because psychologists seem to value these mechanisms more than like political scientists and sociologists seem to value more just estimating the effect of some treatment. And psychologists seem to value more parceling out the mechanisms. And I think that's part of the difference in why field experiments and lab experiments are treated differently in these different fields. Yeah?
I think that the mechanism have maybe many, but two types of mechanism.
Yeah.
One is like how can I say that? Interaction mechanisms for how individual or how individual interaction change the, for example, the collective behavior or something like that. So in that case, like okay, individually people more likely or less likely behave like that. So in the collective level, for example, using agent-based simulation, something like that, then get. So the mechanism is like this. So in that case, we can do like a statistical analysis or like agent-based simulation. But for example, psychologists think about, then why individual behave like that in this social environment. It's very hard to show why the people behave like that in psychologically.
Yes, I think that's a good way of thinking is that the mechanism changes at different levels. So like the mechanism for a group level pattern could be an individual level tendency. And then what's the mechanism for that individual level tendency? Yeah. That's a separate thing that we would have to figure out. Okay, that's a little bit about mechanisms. So I hope that these ideas about thinking about validity, heterogeneity, and mechanisms can help us combine these ideas for understanding with optimization. So for example, there's this idea that like, if you actually understood the mechanism, you could even optimize much, much better. Even if you only care about optimization, mechanisms are really helpful. Yeah?
Right, just looping two things together too. For pre-reg, I think if you're running an experiment where you're expecting a heterogeneous treatment effect, you should definitely pre-reg.
Yes.
Right? Like that to me is like the most clear-cut argument because it's so easy to come up with different, blah, 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 post-hoc subgroup effects that if you think that there's going to be some weird effect on some part of your sample, you should, or I don't think I would believe the results.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it adds so much credibility to what you're doing. Yeah?
I just want to kind of reiterate this point Hera was making because I think it's really important, which is say that lines are a mechanism.
Yeah.
So if you've got a ship that's carrying fruit and a ship that's carrying gold, you start by saying fruit's the mechanism that cures scurvy. Someone else comes along and says it's lime. Someone else comes along and says it's vitamin C. Someone else comes along and says it's, I don't know, whatever vitamin C does.
No, I know. It's like, how does vitamin C do it? That's a whole nother thing, right? Yeah, I think that's totally right. Okay, so that's a little bit about moving beyond simple experiments. And being able to combine optimization and understanding is really important if you want to partner with people to do experiments. So we've hinted at that a couple times. Lots of field experiments involve working with governments or companies or political parties. Lots of digital field experiments involve working with companies. And so this is going to be an important strategy for you if you want to try to do some of these things. Yeah?
Are you taking over for questions or?
Yeah, questions, absolutely.
So like, also just from a science perspective, like, what do people think about the idea? So, there are all these, complex treatment and, design questions that we can get into. But sometimes it seems like from a science perspective, like this simple experiment is the best experiment, right? So like think about the famous, like whether it's a vitamin C experiment, like I sometimes wonder, I don't know, and I'm just curious what other people think. Like, we devote all this time to thinking through like really complex designs, but it seems like the biggest advances scientifically come from, yep, we're just going to give you that, and that's going to change so much, right? I mean, does that maybe that simple experiment only comes after lots of complicated experiments? I don't know. It's just something I've been thinking about.
Thoughts from the experimentalist? Yeah.
So I love simple experiments, but I wouldn't say they're the best in an absolute sense. I mean, I think it really depends on what you're trying to do.
Sure.
So the simple experiments are the best experiments if you really want to establish a clear causal connection, but field experiments are the best experiments if you want to establish that something can actually be employed, and observational studies are the best approach if you just need to get some, if you want to understand what people are already doing.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Okay. So let's talk about how to actually do this. So maybe now you're really excited about experiments. You want to do some experiments. How do you do it? Oh yeah.
Oh, I want to add. I'm sorry. I want to add a plug for formal models, whether agent-based or otherwise, because they're really, really great at helping you explore mechanisms. Obviously, a model can never tell you what actually happened in your data, but if you have a potential mechanism, a model can help you to identify whether that mechanism is sufficient to produce the thing that you observe, especially in these cases where you can't necessarily tease out the thing if somehow the heterogeneity is just inevitably bound up with the population and the treatment. So
cool. So this is part of the thinking that you can do before you do your experiment, is you can do a simulation, do a formal model. Some of you probably already do that.
I'm thinking in my case, after I did an experiment, I had an unexpected outcome.
Yeah.
And we couldn't even experimentally control that, even if we did want to rerun it. So we did a model and said, we think this is what's going on. At least we know it's enough to explain it. We can't say for sure.
Cool.